Well, from Nomad Capitalist Live 2024 in Kuala Lumpur, KL, Malaysia, I'm Bob Henderson. I'm the Nomad Dad, thrilled to be joined by Vusi Thembekwayo. Vusi, welcome to Nomad Capitalist Live.
Yeah, hi Bob. Thanks for having us.
Love your outfit.
You like it, eh? I had you in mind when I
Yes,
donned this morning.
You're from South Africa.
I am, yeah.
And you're a young man.
I'm from the beautiful land of the country in the southernmost tip of the most incredible continent in the world. Yeah.
And you have done some terrific things in a very short period of time.
I don't know. I think God has been good. I think we've been very blessed.
So, tell us about you.
What can I tell you? So I come from South Africa. When we first started our firm, purely coincidental. I had been an investor on a show called Dragon's Den, the original format owned by Sony in the US. You have a similar show called Shark Tank. And I'd been running a consulting firm. I had exited that consulting firm, had a little bit of liquidity, and went and did these deals. And somebody said, you should roll this up into like a structure, maybe start a fund. And I was like, oh, would that work? And that kind of started us off on this incredible journey. So when we first started, we were...
And that would have been when?
That would have been circa 2014.
Okay, so 10 years.
About 10 years. And so then we started. We started in all earnestness. And when we started, initially we were purely focused on South Africa. We then started looking at expanding our horizons. I think, just for context, my vantage point is that because I travel and do a lot of work globally and my network is global, one of the challenges we have, Bob, in attracting capital to the part of the world I'm from is that the opportunity set is just too small to give you a seat around the table. And so if you're meeting with an institutional investor anywhere in, Northern Hemisphere, for a conversation less than $50 million, it's just not worth their time. And for us, $50 million is a very large fund with multiple assets across different geographies. And so there's kind of this need to create, you would understand it, an instrument large enough that it can attract the capital at volume and deploy that capital at volume, but also with sufficient guardrails in place that it can actually manage that capital. And so we're on the path, we think, to building something like this, and we're very excited by the opportunity set.
So you're an entrepreneur.
Yes, sir.
Investor.
Yes, sir.
Mentor.
Yeah, I try.
Consultant to Fortune 500 companies?
That's right, yeah. So I first started, my journey has been interesting because I came from kind of outside the space into the space. So I started public speaking when I was at school, then I was competing in public speaking, and then I won a number of international competitions and then got to travel and live all over the world, which really changes your perspective. And as a South African, it's something about which I'm very acutely aware, is that my vantage point is framed by the fact that I have had unbelievable international exposure at a very early age. So I was, living in Australia, in Sydney, at 17 in 2002. I'd been to the UK, I'd been all over the world. So my world kind of really changed from that perspective. And so when I started working as a professional, I already had a public speaking career, and I kind of built those two in tandem. And it's been a very interesting journey to have an international perspective and a vantage point, but also try to build yourself out as a professional in a particular space.
Why is it that Nelson Mandela had good things to say about you? What is it you did that impressed him so much?
Yeah, so I had just come back from an international public speaking competition, had won Audience Favorite Speaker Prize, won the competition, and then had the unbelievable privilege of meeting him. He'd heard about my winning this competition. Admittedly, I was much younger then, had more hair and a slightly thinner waist, and the newspapers had covered my story. And for the viewers watching this, the context of the story is important because we had come from apartheid. Nobody who looked like me, who came from where I came from, had ventured into public speaking at an international level and competed and won at that level. And so when I did this was covered by almost all of the press across South Africa, both print, television, radio, across the spectrum. And I suppose he must have come upon this. And he'd penned a letter and addressed the letter, and I got invited to meet him. And then, of course, I went to meet him, and it was just the most unbelievable opportunity and exchange. I often say to people who ask me, how was that? And I say, he literally had the ability to bend the laws of physics. He would walk into this room, and the temperature would change. It would drop just that 1.5 degrees.
There are a few people like that, but not many.
100%.
Yeah.
and strong character. He had a presence about him. If he sat next to you, you could feel his energy and feel his aura. I was a kid at the time, but even then I could feel, that transmission of energy. And I think the world today is sorely in need of leaders of that caliber who are able to step up and to do and say the things that are unpopular but are necessary for where the world is and for what we hope the world can deliver for future generations.
Well, tell me about South Africa today. What's the state of affairs?
So I like to think of myself as a person who's able to look at, as Jim Collins says, face the brutal facts. And I think if you look at the brutal facts, we have an economy that hasn't delivered the rates of growth that it has the potential to deliver. So for instance, over the past quarter, our economy grew 0.4% in a like-for-like basis year on year, which is very poor for us. Over the past decade, our economy has grown at less than 1% per year. Of course, you've got to ring-fence the numbers around COVID because there was a massive drop then and then a massive spike up. But if you normalize for that period, we've had a sub 1% economic GDP growth rate.
Well, that's stall speed.
You've got to consider that our population CAGR, I think, is at about 1.6% the last time I checked. So you've got a population growing at a rate faster than the economy. Then if you look at the other macro factors, the largest part of our demography is young people. And we have an unemployment rate of young people well above 42%. The unemployment rate in the country, by the broad definition, which for us includes people who've given up looking for work, is above 40%. The unemployment rate by the narrow definition is above 30%. And to put that in context, when Hitler seized power in Germany, the unemployment rate was just nearing that 20% mark, I think just marginally over. So we have been teetering on the brink of playing with some very, very dangerous macroeconomic factors. In addition to this, disenfranchised youth, lack of work, lack of job opportunities, porous borders, lots of immigration into the country.
From where?
From different parts of the continent, driven in part by a lot of the geopolitical issues in some of our neighboring countries. So for instance, the issues around Zimbabwe are well known and well ventilated. So you've got Zimbabwe, you've had Mozambique, which had its own period of economic difficulty. Before that, had its own period of unrest. And a lot of that drives economic activity. Johannesburg still is the hub of the continent, and let nobody tell you different. I don't have the numbers offhand, but I read somewhere that if you just took Gauteng, which is the province in which Johannesburg is based, and you benchmarked it against other countries in the continent, it would still be somewhere in the top 10. And I might be wrong on the exact number, but it's somewhere high up there, which is to say that even without the instances of geopolitical unrest, the economic opportunities in Johannesburg alone attract a lot of migrant labor, right? And so all of this feeds a country that is having difficulties because you've got young people who come. I am in my family what we call a first generation. So first generation means first to university, probably first to start a formal business, first. I am that in my family, and I'm no exception. There are millions like me out there, right? And yet not all of us are given the same opportunities and pathways that I have been given. So you have this economy that's not growing. You then have migrant labor coming into the country, some documented, some undocumented, finding its way into the labor market. And you can begin to see how this creates a tension in society broadly. And then you add, in addition to this, the fiscal picture. You've got to have a look at the books. The government has been running, and now they're in this program of constraining fiscal spending, cutting budgeting. The other day, the education minister announced that they're cutting spending in the education sector. She estimates that they will be in a position where they'll have to let some teachers go, which is not good if you look at our public education system because it's already overburdened in our public education system. And so the fiscal picture doesn't look good, because you've got an economy that's not growing, a balance sheet that is not growing from a fiscus perspective. And then, of course, they've enacted a national health insurance. And I want to be clear, I'm a believer in the free market. There's no such thing as a pure free market. I think, and none of us who operate in the free market system can ever say, well, this market is so pure. But I'm a believer that the freer markets are, the better the opportunities people have to succeed. And ideologically, that isn't quite where South Africa's zeitgeist is. There's still a huge overhang of kind of that socialist conversation. And that drives, so you add all of these factors together and you begin to see the bubbling under the surface.
Well, how did this come about, this 40% unemployment and all the problems that you've discussed? How does this come about? Frankly, you point out that the unemployment rate was half of that when Hitler came to power. I think in the Great Depression, the highest unemployment rate in the U.S. was 28%.
That's right.
So,
that's right. Yeah.
My goodness, 42% is just way over the top.
It really is. It really is. And there are some statisticians who are of the view that that number is still not an accurate reflection of what the realities on the ground are. But your question is quite pointed. How did it come about? And the difficulty, you'd be well versed in this, Bob, is the difficulty with the modern day is we have this tendency to simplify complex issues. This is a really complex issue. So there is a large part of it that is the apartheid overhang. The apartheid system was designed on an exclusionary framework and system. And here's how it worked, and I'll give you the 15-second breakdown.
No, go a little longer if you want, because I'm not sure everybody understands how it worked.
Because the people like me, who looked like me and came from where I came from, operated in an environment where by law there were certain things we were not able to do and certain jobs we were not able to have. And so this is in part why I'm saying in my family I would be the first person to reach a certain level of education. Because even though there might not have been a law saying if you are black you can't, the system was such that it was as near as makes no difference, impossible for you to reach that level of education in the first place. And so the system of apartheid is the direct translation into the English, was that there was an economy for the economy for white people in South Africa, and then an economy for the rest of the peoples of South Africa, the majority of which, over 70%, is Black African, which I am. Then we have what we call Indians and Coloreds, who are a different race designate. But the economy was built in large part to support only this population of white people, right? And so the rest of us then kind of function in other parts of the economic system, but predominantly my people, Black African people, were the cheap labor into the economic system to get this economy to grow. And so that's the overhang. The missed opportunity is the government in power has had 30 years to really do meaningful transformation of this economy. This is to transform your network industries, build new infrastructure, bring a lot of investment into the country, modernize the economy, and in large part has missed that opportunity.
Why?
For several reasons. And again, complex, but for several reasons. One, self-interest, right? When you are a party as powerful as the incumbent was, I mean, at a point in time, there were close on 70% of the vote. When you're that powerful, there just isn't a lot of incentive for you to transform and to change, because your competitors, you know this in business, if you're 70% of market share, and then the other 30 players are the remaining 30%, you tend to approach things very, very differently. And so one of the things that's shifting now is they have had a steady decline. Over the most recent election, the sharpest decline. The governing party went from 57% of the vote to 40% of the vote, shedding 17%, you think in business terms, of their market share over a single 5-year period, is a marked difference. This changes the complexion, because now that they're at 40%, they're having to work with other parties to govern the country. And those of us who are, and I always say to people, I don't care about the politics, I care about the people. And we just get the country to work. And we can differ on how we get there, but let's agree on what there is. Let's agree on the destination. What's the destination? You want a country that works, that is safe. We still have a massive crime problem. My own father was murdered when I was 13 years old. They never caught the killers. The docket was opened twice and lost twice because of the third issue, which is the corruption issue, right? And then you add on top of this all these other fiscal issues. It's quite a dire picture. Yet, in the midst of this, I still come from the country that birthed Elon Musk. I come from the country that created Mark Shuttleworth, right? So we're still that people. We're still that country. And I think it's important. I'd certainly take it as a responsibility, Bob, wherever I am, to try and present the real picture, but also present the balanced picture. The balanced picture is there's still huge upside, massive opportunity. If you're looking to be a long-term player whose feet and hands are on the ground, doing the actual work, building with builders, we have a fantastic country and an economy. We still fantastic road network. We have ports. They work now. We had a recent issue where the ports were not working and functioning optimally. We have a fantastic banking system, great legal framework. And in my country, it still holds true that if you and I have a commercial disagreement and I sue you, the courts will actually hear the matter and the judgment will hold. And there are many countries in the world for which that is just not the case. So there's a lot working for us.
So the infrastructure's there.
Oh, the infrastructure is definitely in place.
Yeah.
This is why I spoke about this lost opportunity of 30 years, because the base infrastructure was there. And one hopes that this new spark, this new wave of optimism is going to reignite the country in the right direction. South Africa needs, at the very least, a 2% economic growth rate, GDP sustained over a period of 10 years, to have any meaningful impact of drawing people into the labor market and beginning to reduce that unemployment rate. That's the first thing it needs. Second thing it needs is to become very intentional about migration and about controlled migration. And to be clear, I'm not saying shut the borders, but I am saying I am a global citizen. That's why I'm at Nomad Capitalist. But there is nowhere in the world I am where I am not there without the proper documentation. And I don't know when it happened, Bob, that saying to people, you can be here but follow the process, became a politically volatile point. This is, otherwise, what's the purpose of having the law then, right?
Yeah, you're no longer a country if you don't have borders.
100%. So I think if we get those simple basics in place, we would be on a home run.
Well, what do you do about education? I mean, that is critically important. How do you turn that around?
Sure.
Does it get privatized?
Sure, Bob, you know your stuff, eh? So here is the difficulty. If you understand the demographic picture that I've painted for you, you understand the historic injustices suffered by a large part of the population, that also means that they don't have the economic means to afford privatized education. Now, the state in South Africa says it is law that your children must receive an education. It's legislated in the Bill of Rights. So you must get an education. The difficulty is that, and there are many pundits about this and differing points of views, but for those of us who track the data, the difficulty is that the education levels at the public education institutions has a long way to go still. And so what we've seen more recently has been an emergence of a number of private education players who've been stepping into the breach and filling that gap, predominantly for the middle class, the large part of which, it must be said, has been a black middle class that's like myself, who've come from spaces where we are not middle class and can afford to now be in the middle classes. And so there's been a provision of that. But you must understand that socialist ideological overhang, because every time this happens, what happens is there begins a conversation in the political quarters that says private interest seems to be making an impact there. We need to stop that. And it's happened in the health system. And my view is that it might likely happen in the education system too, right? Where you find a state with respect that hasn't proven itself all that competent at running a particular thing, now thinking it can run the whole thing and even take it away from private interest. So education is fundamental, and reducing the cost of education is fundamental. My view is you reduce the cost of education by deregulating the market, by opening up for more players to operate in that space, by making it easier for people to do online education and all of those kind of educational technology platforms easier to operate in the space. And that if you do this, you know, it's the rising tides elevating all ships. If you drive supply, then the demand is fixed and the price will drop. No. It isn't the inverse, and I think there'll be a bit of an ideological debate in the country at the moment about what's the way to go. Well, I hate to be so morbid, sorry.
No. In the U.S., I think a big problem is this victimhood society. Sir. Now, you talk about injustices there, and obviously you're right about that. Is there a victimhood mentality today in South Africa which may be holding back a segment of the population?
You know, one of the difficulties is that it's a real lived injustice for a lot of people. So my view isn't necessarily that it is the victimhood of the citizen. I think my view is it's whom it is against which the citizens must hold that state responsible, right? So, and my view, again, is after a particular period, you've got to begin to look in the mirror and say, look, we might not like where we are, but perhaps we need to start looking at who's responsible for us being where we are. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is we do have quite a way to go in terms of re-educating a large part of the population around not only personal responsibility, which I think is well weaved into the system, but more importantly around how we can think of ourselves as global citizens, because I think that's a big missing part for us in the conversation piece. But this victimhood, as you call it, it's something all of us have to begin to straddle and to struggle with. And so I'm often on opposite ends and opposing ends with people who come from that particular perspective. And I try to meet them halfway. And one of the things I say is, listen, I understand why you say what you say and why you feel the way you feel. And I completely empathize because actually I've been where you are. I get it. But let's agree on who's responsible for your being where you are before we can talk about how you get out of where you are. Where I think South Africa is different is that there is only a certain amount of the blame you can apportion to who was responsible pre-94, and then a particular amount of the blame you must apportion for who's been responsible after that. It's a controversial point of view. It's a point of view about which, particularly on social media, I've taken a lot of heat. But it's a point of view that I hold. My point of view is study other parts of the world that have transformed themselves. We're here today. We had an entire session talking about emerging markets. And if you look at other emerging markets all over the world, you realize that 30 years is sufficient time for a government in power that has been intentional to have made a marked difference in the lives of its citizens. So we can't let those in charge escape that responsibility.
Well, you heard my talk this
I did,
morning,
yeah. I really enjoyed it.
I
Thank
brought
you.
a chart.
Yeah.
And I focused on 4 countries,
Yeah.
2 great
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
situations
Yeah,
and
yeah.
2
Yeah.
not great situations. So the great situations were Poland, which was a communist country. So this was a chart showing GDP back to 1998. 25 years, 1 generation. And it's been straight up.
Yeah.
But they had all the disadvantages coming in because they were a communist nation.
Yeah.
And look what they've done. It can be done. Estonia was another one. Not quite as good, but still pretty darn good. They weren't as oppressed, but they did answer to Moscow in the Cold War era. And the other 2 were rich nations that blew it, Argentina and Venezuela.
Venezuela, yeah.
So, a little hubris in those cases. So the point is, it can be done, but people have to change the mindset, I would think. And it seems to me that's your big challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've absolutely nailed it.
Now, here's the thing, and I could be criticized for making a racial comment because, let's be honest, Estonia and Poland are primarily whites.
White.
And so to say that a country that's predominantly black would take on the things that you discussed, like personal responsibility and looking in the mirror and saying, well, I have the ability to change this, that might be racist. I'm imposing my white supremacy values on. Well, how would you respond to that? I mean, it works, what they did, and you told me you just want to see what works. That's what you want to see happen.
I think.
Is that the wrong approach?
One of the fallacies you learn in classical public speaking and debating is you're taught that just because you present statistics and data and facts doesn't mean people will change their minds, because some people are really committed.
They're dug in, their heels are dug in.
That's right. They're just committed to a particular point of view. It doesn't matter what the facts say. And so the narrative, and so for them it's, this is my narrative, let me find the facts, rather than these are the facts, let me try and substantiate and find the narrative. And in the world of geopolitics, one also can't oversimplify how connected the world is, how complex these issues are, and how different nations have different power asymmetries that plays itself out at a geopolitical nation-state level. But at the end of the day, here's what the lesson of history is. We're a people, have a point of view, a dream for which they're building, a vision that they believe in, leaders who are willing to take them there, and are willing to hold each other accountable. They get it done. It's that simple, right? And I think we have to ask and answer the question, have we ticked all 5 of these boxes? One of the challenges I think we have in South Africa, again, I've said this publicly, I think there's a divergence of what is the vision for the country. And you know, as a father, you can't run a family without a vision. You certainly can't run a community without a vision. You can't build a society without a vision. So forget trying to build a country without a vision. And I think if you went to 10 different South Africans and said, what's your vision for this country for the next 20 years? The answers might differ. I spend a lot of time in many parts of the world. I just came back from the Middle East. I was just in the UAE. If you ask an Emirati, what is the vision for the United Arab Emirates? The answer is clear, whether they're working in a government office or are high up in the echelons of business. It's the same single answer. My view is that there must come a time when, as Africans, we draw a line on who we blame for our past, and we go, from this point forward, we're going to talk about who's accountable for our future. And I have not yet.
And got to look in the mirror, and you're accountable for your future.
And this is the point I was going to make. I have not yet seen a record of history where a people have built a future by obsessing over who pained them in the past and getting stuck there. Now, it's important to have those conversations. It's important to clear that up. It's important to have true reconciliation and nation building. This is example South Africa brings to the rest of the world. Don't pretend that stuff doesn't exist. That's why we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Sit around the table, talk about who pained whom, who hurt whom, and why that matters. All of those things are important. And then there's a time when you draw the line in the sand and say, right, now how do we build for the future?
Let's go get them.
And recognize, and then lastly, one last thing, recognize that there's never been a time in history where a full population of a country started from the same point. I accept my disadvantage as a young black person growing up in a township in South Africa. I also accept that I'm not as disadvantaged as a young black female growing up in a rural part of the northern provinces who didn't go to a Model C school like I did. I accept that I have more privilege than her. And I accept that in the classes where I sat, if you were a young white person, you come from a different background and you were more privileged than I. I accept it. But then I draw a line in the sand and then I say, right, now that I've accepted it, let you and I go to the marketplace of competition because I'm going to show you. Let's write the exam and let's see who's going to get the better marks. Let's do the competition. And I think if we take on that spirit of conquest, of competition, of personal agency, this is how greatness is built and this is how countries achieve for greatness.
Is family big and important in South Africa?
Family is big. Family is important. But like everywhere in the world, the institution of family is also under attack. I'm a believer, and so I have my own personal view about what's happening spiritually and why I think that is. But it's a lot of the way I try to explain the kind of sometimes of the psychology, if you want to understand, is a lot of, and this is what I think the United States does not yet fully appreciate. The United States is still the megaphone of the world. It is the largest exports coming out of the US are not any of the projects you produce. It's the media you create. There are people all over the world who've never been to the US but know rap music, and they can recite every single line by every single rap musician. If you want to be huge in music and arts and entertainment, where you've got to make it is the US. That's why they say, in New York, if you make it there, you'll make it everywhere. If you want to work in capital markets today, what's the place you want to go to? It's still Wall Street. And so for those of us in emerging and frontier markets, and please, my countrymen, hear me, I'm not trying to belittle who we are and what we contribute to the rest of the world. But you can't argue still that the vantage point from which the US transmits its message is just levels and levels above the rest of the world. The problem then is when the US also transmits messages that often are counter the narrative of what is accepted in particular countries and their cultures, that also permeates. So when the US, for instance, starts saying things such as maybe family is not that important, that permeates. When the US says things such as, maybe a belief in a creator is not important, that also permeates. And I think to understand where we are, you often have to understand the messages that the US is sending to the rest of the world. And the US has to understand that those messages do have implications.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. As a US citizen, as I travel around the world, they find out I'm US, they get a smile on their face. Oh, I can't wait to come to the US. Or I was in your country one time. Where did you go? It's always New York or California.
That's right, yeah.
That's where it is.
East or West.
Yeah. So...
and by the way, just on that, it's interesting how most people don't travel into the middle part, which is real America, right? That's really
real
where
America.
The US is.
Yeah, that's where we're from. So how does Africa as a continent stack up today? I mean, we're talking frontier markets, but what's the prognosis as far as you're concerned? Should I be thinking about investing?
Yes.
What's going on?
It's investment 101, and you're a lot more experienced in the industry than I am, to always balance out your risks and balance out your portfolio. So once you've taken on the necessary positions and risks in more developed markets and spaces you understand, should you be looking at frontier markets? The answer is yes, because they do present, I think, a well-priced in opportunity. Should you be looking at Africa? Of course, I'm going to say yes, because that's our space, that's where we operate, that's home for us, and we genuinely believe in the people. What's the prognosis? The stats are out, and we were discussing some of them during conference, which is the growth of urbanization rate, the growth of people getting access, for instance, to power and electricity, that's skyrocketing. The youth urbanization rate, the number of young people coming into the system, all of those, the macros are in place, right? I would say, though, if you're a global investor taking a view on whether or not I should be in Africa, as I said today, I gave those 3 tips. The first tip is get a local partner, because you need somebody who's going to walk the path with you, because it's an exciting but treacherous path. And you want to be there with people who are going to play the long-term game with you. And that's the strategy often that we take. The second is have a time horizon that is consistent with the environment that you are operating in, right? There are still many parts of, particularly in frontier markets, not as much in the emerging parts of the continent, but there's still many parts of the continent, for instance, where liquidity is a challenge. And so getting into an asset might be easy, getting out becomes a problem. And there aren't a lot of players to whom you can exit. And so you're really hoping for, an exit on a public exchange, or an exit in other parts of the world, and that presents its own time horizons. And then third, I think I would say do it in the spirit, in the right spirit. Do it to truly work with the local people, build and develop, and recognize that you will have an impact beyond the balance sheet. And so you've got to be driven by wanting to have an impact beyond the balance sheet. For us, we're mission-led in how we engage with partners and investors. And so the most important thing for me is that the people we're dealing with are of the same mission that we are, and understand that we're going to be evaluating ourselves not just on IRRs, but we're also going to be evaluating ourselves on impact in society, on what we can do to the people, the countries, the communities where we are invested. And if on those things we're aligned, then we're happy to walk this path.
What countries right now should we be looking at?
South Africa, for sure, still top of the pile. South Africa, Nigeria, of course. It's still true what they say: if you're not in Nigeria, you're not in Africa. But make sure that you check your P's and Q's. Ghana, very exciting, is having its own macro issues at the moment. The currency's been struggling. There are some political challenges happening there, but still very exciting prospects and opportunities. The DRC constantly has its own issues, but the DRC still is the mineral cradle of the world, right? It's where the whole world goes to when they're looking at producing technologies. And then almost all of the North African countries. You've got to look at Egypt, you've got to look at Morocco. And then, of course, in terms of where to base yourself, Seychelles, you'd know well. Mauritius, you would know well. Yeah. And then also have a look at, the East African corner. I like the East African corner. We spend a lot of time there. We get a lot of love there. And we do a lot of business in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and Rwanda. Those for us are very exciting economies still. And so I would look at those kind of top 10 economies. And in those top 10 economies, I would look at the industries that are core to the development and growth of those economies.
And what are those industries?
So agriculture, for sure, fintech, and not just financial services, but in particular fintech. Because what we're seeing is as the young people in the continent are urbanizing, accessing more internet and transacting more online, they need the financial undergirding to be able to transact. That's the first. The second is one of the largest contributors still to FX into the continent is remittances from people living in other parts of the world who's sending money back home. And so all of that capital also needs the financial architecture and infrastructure to be able to move money around the continent. And there are several now very high growth startups who are operating in that space. So I would look at agri, I would look at fintech, I would look at educational technology, ed tech, because this young population that's growing requires education. And the governments can't build schools with 4 walls fast enough for the rate at which the population is developing. And secondly, I look at my kids, they don't carry school bags anymore. They learn everything on the tablet. And so I think internet dropping, cost of internet dropping, speed of internet going up, and access to technology at a cheaper rate means you can begin to deliver a whole host of services. These are, as I've said, ad tech, fintech. We were looking at a health tech business just the other day, built by an unbelievable young man, comes from Uganda, now lives in the United States, and he's basically trying to build a 911 emergency, but for Uganda, right? And it's a very exciting business, very exciting prospects. And he's thinking about how does he create an insurance product underneath that so that he can develop other services. This is the kind of stuff that's happening. But for me, I would look at what are the things people need every day. They need food, they need to send their kids to school, they need power, they need water, they need to send money. If you look at any of those sectors, in any of the aforementioned economies, you will find decent enough opportunities. And then the final thing I would say, don't rush. Take your time. This is the most important piece of advice I give every single person.
This is buy and hold.
Yeah, this is so it's both before you enter and then once you're in. Take your time, do the correct due diligences, make sure that your partners check out that the technology is real, that they actually are having that impact. We've had several instances of numbers being inflated. Just make sure you're dealing with that what you're presented with on the deck is true and real.
Is there something akin to an SEC?
Oh yeah,
that would help you with that sort of thing.
There's several. There's several. I must tell you, the regulatory framework is really, really strong, especially in countries like South Africa. We have unbelievable regulators, even in Egypt, even in Morocco, even in Kenya, Nigeria. They're very, very, very strong regulators. There is lots of work happening at the moment to get the regulators to better coordinate efforts, right? And that work will take time. But in different countries, you tend to find that the regulators know what they're doing and that they're very strong.
Green revolution, the minerals you talk about. Is Africa going to supply those minerals to the world? Is that what we're talking about as far as your minerals are concerned?
I think that's already baked into the numbers. It's definitely happening for sure. Yeah, it's happening for sure. And then, of course, as you were talking about the green revolution, it's also the renewable energy space and the amount of it must be this year, and I haven't checked the latest stats, but there was certainly a time between 2020 and 2022, say, when fintech was the fastest growing sector in the venture and private equity space in terms of attracting capital. I'm willing to bet that that's fast and furiously shifting to energy. But I also think if you begin to look at that mid-market space, there's probably more transactions happening in the energy space. The banks at the moment are all long on energy because people are beginning to understand that it's a necessity. And many countries on the continent are experiencing what we either call load shedding, load reduction, which is intermittent power cuts. And there are many countries that go for hours on a daily basis without access to power. And so that's sensitized citizens to how else do I get access to power? And in a zero marginal cost economy, you put that panel in your roof. The sun has not yet sent me an invoice. I don't know about you. So there is real opportunities to begin to drive at that. One of our clients and partners is a company that was just named in the Financial Times 100 fastest growing companies in Africa. And they operate in exactly that space. They operate in the renewable energy space. They sell a lot of product into the renewable energy, both commercial, industrial, as well as residential. And they've seen, true story, Bob, they've seen 3 or 4x growth year on year consistently for the past 3-4 years, in large part because they are fantastic operators, but also in large part because the market is growing. And so as the cost per kilowatt hour drops because the technology is getting better and the manufacturer for that technology is also becoming more efficient, and there are more people wanting to get access to this technology, that market will grow. In the markets from which I come from, where you might not necessarily have the liquidity, capital, or savings, it also means that those provisioning capital into households, commercial, and industrial operators to acquire this power and pay it off over a period of time, they're beginning to grow too. So you're seeing banks make all sorts of products available in that space. It really is an exciting time.
Demographics on your side in most of Africa?
Oh yeah, I mean we have by far the youngest continent in the world. I mean, I think if you have a look, there's an interesting graph that was done, and I'd advise the viewers to go check it out. Done by Factbook CIA, and they went and pulled up the rest of the world, and they showed the average age by country, and Africa has the largest green, which is people 20 and younger, right? And so demographics definitely on our side. Nick said something during the conference, and I thought he's really sharp, Nick, I like him. But he said something during the conference which I thought was interesting. He said that the average age, or that the largest part of the population is young people not yet having turned 18, which means they're not yet in the productive economy.
Well, that may be 10 years down the road before that begins to show up.
Exactly. And so his thesis is, well, you got this massive youth population must come into the world of work. And as it comes into the world of work, will drive spending, will drive savings, will drive investments, and that, of course, will then begin to elevate those economies. So definitely the right demographics, for sure, no question.
Well, demographics, as the great Mark Stein once said, the future belongs to those who show up. And if you're, replacing yourselves in terms of birth rates and demographics are young. My concluding thought is, in my lifetime, the two best decades in the U.S. were the 80s and 90s. And you can talk about maybe the policies were good policies, but you can't overlook the fact that my generation, the baby boomer generation, was coming of age in those decades, and it may be the main reason why the 80s and 90s were so good, and we haven't replicated that since, because now we're getting older and we're taking money from the system rather than contributing. Having young demographics, I would think, would be a reason, assuming the political framework is positive.
Yes, sir.
I would think that'd be a reason to look at the continent for sure.
Completely agreed. I must tell you, it's an honor and a privilege for me to finally meet the Nomad Dad.
Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you, Vusi.
Thank you, sir.
Vusi Thembekwayo. I'm the Nomad Dad, Bob Henderson.
This is Kuala Lumpur. This is going to be the craziest live like a king you've ever seen.